Okay, my name is Liz Wilshin, and I am a MSGIST student who is finishing up in just a few weeks. This is my presentation on visualizing historic housing discrimination, mapping exclusionary covenants in Tucson, Arizona. I'm the graduate student researcher for Mapping Racist Covenants out of the University of Arizona, and this is my proof of concept for that project. The objective for this project specifically, not mapping racist covenants overall, is to geospatially visualize historic covenants, conditions, and restrictions alongside contemporary household demographics data in Tucson, Arizona. You'll hear me say CC&R or CCR throughout this presentation, and that is a reference to covenants, conditions, and restrictions. You can see on the right-hand side over here, there are a couple of historic photos courtesy of the University of Arizona's Special Collections. I guess it's just special collections from the library at University of Arizona. You can see some workers with cacti on the right, as well as a photo of the stadium along Cherry Avenue. And then just below those two images is a photo of a CCR, which does contain a racial exclusion. You can see that highlighted in that kind of light pink color. And this is kind of a template that you can expect to find of any CCR that's going to exclude a person based on their race. So it says here, no persons of any race other than blank race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that the covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled within and with an owner or tenant. And so that's just a legalese kind of way of saying that, you know, people of whatever race are not permitted to reside in that neighborhood unless they're a domestic servant for that person. So this project is largely comprised of data collection and getting our data from various sources. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions historically were deemed to be unconstitutional and unenforceable in 1948 with Shelley versus Kramer. And then additionally in 1968, the Fair Housing Act did make it so that CCRs became a less common practice, if not altogether a practice that didn't occur anymore. And so in the data collection there was an initial review of existing research on this topic throughout the US, mostly from Mapping Prejudice out of Minnesota, and then also some other segregation related research from researchers in MRC, Mapping Racist Covenants. After that initial review, we did some data cleaning, which consisted of basically collecting data from the City of Tucson, other trusted government sources like the US Census, and clearing it out so that it's a little bit easier for a user to be able to interact with. We also had a record identification phase, and so that looked like us going physically to the Pima County Recorder's Office to collect the historic records that you'll see displayed in the final product from Mapping Racist Covenants. So I am not located in Tucson at the moment, and this record identification phase was researchers going to the recorder's office in person, looking through books and various page numbers in an online database, and then reviewing those historic records to see if there were any racial exclusions like what I showed you earlier. That consisted of over 3,500 records that we had to go through from the periods of 1912 to 1968. 1912 is when Arizona was founded as a state, and 1968 is when the Fair Housing Act was enacted. Record request management did become more of my responsibility as we started to figure out which of the historic CCRs did contain racial exclusions and which ones did not contain racial exclusions. The collection of data was based on subdivisions within the city of Tucson, and you'll be able to see that visualized in just a moment. We also had a verification phase that is just wrapping up, I believe, and it is a manual review of those records that we received from the Pima County Recorder's Office, a manual transcribing of those records because they were a file type that was not readable for a Tesseract program that was developed and some of the images are a little bit of lower quality. Because it's not been made publicly available yet, it's not contained within this slideshow except for what I showed you earlier, but it will be made publicly available in the future. And I made this a little bit more interactive a moment ago. Okay, so we have the methodology. You can see on the left-hand side a series of polygons. Some of them are blue, some of them are red. This is the ultimate web map that was created as a proof of concept in order to show the feasibility of mapping this data for the Mapping Races Covenants team. A series of spatial joins were implemented in order to enrich the data. And that meant that we had these subdivision polygons that had things like the name of the subdivision, the geographic information of the coordinates, the area of the subdivision. And it was further enriched by adding census data to it. Things like ethnicity, is a person Hispanic or not Hispanic? Does someone identify as being a single race or not? These were all things that were added to these polygons in order to make it a more contextually useful set of data for a user. So the methodology did include a series of what's called arcade expressions. Arcade is language from Esri, which is the mapping software that was used in order to display the data in a pop-up window you can see on the right-hand side over here. So the first arcade expression that you see is in reference to the subdivision name. And it has, I would say, a moderate level of complexity in order to display either the subdivision name or NA for non-applicable. As you can see on the bottom left-hand corner, there is a little bit more complexity with this arcade expression because it does have a template to add a URL and have it be something that a user would be able to click on and go to a data repository containing that CCR. Because it's a proof of concept and the data repository wasn't available to me at the time of its development, it does show NA, but the architecture is in place for researchers to add that information for the public in the future. And you can see here, we have the web application. I'm going to go ahead and click here and show it to you. So the first thing the user is going to come across is a content warning so that users can be informed and give their consent to engage with this data. It also has an acknowledgement regarding the complexity of this kind of history. You can see on the bottom, it shows here a proof of concept warning. Because this data isn't publicly available yet, and this is also prior to the finalized verification of this data, it would be appreciated if anyone attending today's presentation would please keep anything that you see today to yourself until it is publicly available on August 25th. And none of this data should be used for decision making. So on the right-hand side over here, it has a simple yes or no. Does this subdivision have a racist CCR? Everything in blue is a no and everything in red is a yes. There is a button over here for information on how to use this map, a search function and a filter function. I'm going to go ahead and click here, and it does show you a tour of the map. There are videos that a user can watch that are just simple screen recordings to explain various functionality of how this web application functions. The web application does contain the web map that was made previously, and I'm going to go ahead and just search here for the University of Arizona Museum of Art. You can see that the web map does zoom to the University of Arizona, and a user can scroll out and have access to whichever polygon subdivision is relevant. You can see here that this one does not contain subdivision or neighborhood association information because it was either developed prior to 1912 or after 1968. But if we were to zoom out some more, we could click on one of these red polygons, and it's going to give us information about Blindman Elm, the Olson's edition within Blindman Elm. And it has here, the racist terms that someone would be able to find within that original CCNR, groups that are impacted, the year, and then that manually transcribed text is available to a user. On the left-hand side, you can see that there is 2020 census demographics of this subdivision as well as the census tract number, and a pie chart showing the demographic information. So this one over here shows that it is 70% white alone, with 16% of the population identifying as Hispanic or Latino. It has information about the total population below that pie chart, and then the total housing units as well. All of this data is from the 2020 decennial census. And then there is also a filter function. Mapping Racist Covenants did have an advisory board formed in order to inform the research process and make suggestions throughout. When they were shown the ultimate, or I should say penultimate map developed by one of the researchers, they did have feedback about the filtering of data. So if I were to click on the home button and get you back to that previous extent, I would be able to view people who are excluded based on their race or ethnicity. For example, this is Hispanic or Latino only. I can select white only neighborhoods as well. And the feedback that we got basically was to have a little bit more clarity on how this filtering function works for the general public. Right. Now, as for the results, it did show that there is a feasibility for us to display this data. We have kind of architecture in place in order to display URLs for a user to click on and then be able to read through a CCR of, a study area that's relevant to them, and an interactivity of showing the most current demographic data available to the users. The design was iterative. We started with these various polygons that didn't have too much context based on our research. And we were able to change that into something that had a little bit more context and meaning as the research process developed. And we were able to enrich that with demographic data. And opportunities for future study really are expanding the research to be at a nationwide scale, adding more context as to how CCRs have changed neighborhoods over time, and I'm sure so much more that I haven't even considered. So right now, if you were to think of this as a road that we were on, we are at the proof of concept stage. The final validation is also just starting to wrap up, and the results launch is happening August 25th, 2023, which is open to the public. And the Mapping Racist Covenants team is very excited to share the results with everyone. And that is it for me.
Thank you, Liz. You did a fantastic